$63 million. That is not a guess. That is not an estimate rounded up for dramatic effect. $63 million is what Kenny Anderson earned across 14 seasons in the National Basketball Association. And in 2005, the same year the last team in the league cut him loose, the same year his mother passed away after a heart attack, Kenny Anderson filed for bankruptcy. Every dollar gone. Let that settle for a moment. $63 million. A man could live 10 lifetimes on that money and never feel the pinch. But Kenny Anderson didn't just spend it. He hemorrhaged it through entourages, through failed marriages, through child support obligations to 5 different women, through a lifetime habit of saying yes to every hand that reached toward him. By the time the basketball stopped, there was nothing left. Not the cars, not the houses, not the people who used to crowd around him at every turn. And here is what makes that number so difficult to comprehend. Kenny Anderson was not some marginal player who stumbled into a contract he didn't deserve. He was the number 2 overall pick in the 1991 NBA Draft. He was an all-star. He was, for a brief and brilliant window, one of the most electrifying point guards in professional basketball. Before that, he was the most celebrated high school player in New York City history. A prodigy so gifted that college recruiters started tracking him when he was in the 6th grade. But beneath the handles and the headlines, beneath the all-star selection and the $63 million, Kenny Anderson was carrying damage that no amount of money could repair. An absent father he wouldn't meet until his 30s. A mother battling her own demons. Childhood trauma so severe he couldn't speak about it publicly until he was in his 40s. 7 children, 5 women. A troubled relationship with alcohol that would land him in a courtroom. And a slow, grinding erosion of everything he had built. Not in one catastrophic moment, but over years. One bad decision stacked on top of another, until the whole structure collapsed. This is not just a story about basketball, and it is not just a story about money. This is a story about what happens when a boy from the projects gets everything he ever dreamed of and discovers that none of it can fix what was broken inside him from the very beginning. But to understand how Kenny Anderson lost $63 million, you first have to understand LeFrak City, Queens, a place where the basketball courts were the only escape, and where a 6-year-old boy was already learning that the adults around him couldn't protect him from anything. Kenny Anderson was born on October 9, 1970, and raised in LeFrak City, Queens, a sprawling housing development in New York City that was home to thousands of families packed into towers of brick and concrete. LeFrak City was not the worst place in New York. It was not the most dangerous, not the most neglected, but it was dense, loud, and unforgiving. A place where opportunity was something you heard about on television, not something that knocked on your door. Kenny grew up poor. His mother, Joan, raised him largely on her own. His father was absent, completely, thoroughly absent. Kenny Anderson would not meet his own father until he was in his 30s. For the entirety of his childhood, for the years when a boy most needs a steady hand and a model of what a man is supposed to be, there was no one filling that role. Joan did what she could, but Joan had her own battles. She struggled with alcohol and substance abuse. She cycled through unstable relationships. The home was chaotic and crowded, and at times young Kenny found himself sleeping in the same room as his mother and her boyfriend, a man who was abusive. There was no private space, no sanctuary, no quiet corner where a child could feel fully protected from the turbulence of the adult world around him. And yet, this was the environment that produced one of the most naturally gifted basketball players New York City had ever seen. The outdoor courts of Queens became Kenny's classroom, his theater, his church. On the asphalt, with a ball in his hands, the noise from the apartment faded. The chaos at home didn't matter. The missing father didn't matter. On the court, Kenny Anderson had control. On the court, people watched him with awe instead of pity. And in a neighborhood where basketball was the universal language, a kid who could handle the ball the way Kenny could was treated like royalty. But no amount of crossover dribbles could erase what was happening away from the court. And inside that chaotic world, young Kenny Anderson was living through experiences no child should ever have to carry. Experiences he would not speak about publicly for more than 30 years. In 2013, Kenny Anderson did something that very few professional athletes have ever done. He spoke publicly about deeply painful childhood experiences that had followed him for most of his life. According to his own account, 2 separate adults in his orbit, a neighbor and a basketball coach, crossed lines no adult should ever cross with a child. 2 people who had access to a young boy growing up in an environment where supervision was inconsistent and protection was unreliable. 2 people who turned that access into lasting damage. He carried it while becoming famous, while earning $63 million, and while watching every cent disappear. He carried it in silence, the way so many people carry childhood pain, not because it faded, but because speaking about it felt almost impossible. His mother had given him a nickname as a toddler, Mr. Chibbs. It was an affectionate name, a term of endearment from a woman who loved her son, even as she struggled to keep her own life from unraveling. That nickname would later become the title of a documentary about Kenny's life, a film that forced him to confront the full weight of what he had endured. But as a child, he had no documentary, no platform, no therapist, and no language for the pain he was carrying. He had basketball, and basketball gave him applause, escape, identity, and eventually millions of dollars. But it could not reach the places inside him that had already been damaged. It could cover the wound. It could not heal it. The patterns that would later shape Kenny Anderson's adult life, the unstable relationships, the compulsive generosity, the inability to set boundaries, the deep and unshakable need to be surrounded by people, did not begin when he signed his first NBA contract. They began in LeFrak City, in a childhood where safety was taken from him before he was old enough to understand what safety was supposed to feel like. But here is what makes Kenny Anderson's story so extraordinary. Even while enduring all of this, he was becoming the most talked-about young basketball player in the entire country. And by the time he was 14 years old, his name was on the front page of every sports section in New York City. The scouts started showing up when Kenny Anderson was in the 6th grade. Not high school scouts, college scouts, grown men from major university programs making trips to Queens to watch a child play basketball, because even at that age, the talent was undeniable. The handles, the vision, the composure under pressure. It was all there, fully formed, in a boy who had not yet reached his teenage years. By the time Kenny enrolled at Archbishop Molloy High School in Queens, the Whisper Network had already done its work. Everybody in New York City basketball knew his name. And over the next 4 years, he would turn those whispers into a roar. At Molloy, Kenny Anderson set the all-time New York State high school scoring record with 2,621 points, a record that would stand for 15 years until Sebastian Telfair broke it in 2004. He was named a Parade All-American 4 times, a feat that had not been accomplished since Lou Alcindor, the player who would become Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He was the first player ever named All-City 4 consecutive times. By his senior year, he was ranked the #1 high school player in the entire country, ahead of Jimmy Jackson, ahead of Shaquille O'Neal. He won the Gatorade National Player of the Year award, was named a McDonald's All-American, and collected virtually every national honor available to a high school basketball player. And he was 14 years old when the New York City sports pages first put his name on the front page. 14. A freshman being treated like the future of basketball, while privately carrying wounds no coach, scout, reporter, or screaming fan in the gymnasium could see. Every powerhouse program in America came calling. North Carolina, Duke, Syracuse. The entire college basketball world was fighting over Kenny Anderson. But the school he chose surprised almost everyone. And the reason he chose it would set the stage for one of the most electric chapters in college basketball history. Kenny Anderson chose Georgia Tech, not North Carolina, where Dean Smith was building dynasties, not Duke, where Mike Krzyzewski was assembling his empire, not Syracuse, which would have kept him close to home. Georgia Tech, in Atlanta, a program with talent, but without the blue blood pedigree of the schools that had pursued him most aggressively. At Georgia Tech, Anderson joined forces with two upperclassmen who were already established stars: Dennis Scott, a lethal three-point shooter, and Brian Oliver, a versatile and relentless scorer. Together, the three of them formed a trio that the college basketball world dubbed Lethal Weapon 3, named after the popular film franchise. It was not just a marketing nickname, it was an accurate description of what they did to opponents. In Anderson's freshman season, 1989 to 1990, Lethal Weapon 3 carried Georgia Tech all the way to the Final Four. They were stopped only by UNLV, the eventual national champion, one of the most dominant teams in college basketball history. But reaching the Final Four as a freshman, playing on that stage at that age, cemented Kenny Anderson's reputation as a player destined for the highest level of the sport. Then Scott and Oliver graduated. The supporting cast was gone. And rather than shrink under the burden of carrying a team alone, Anderson expanded. In his sophomore season, he averaged nearly 26 points per game. An absurd number for a point guard, a figure that placed him among the most productive players in all of college basketball. He was doing everything: scoring, distributing, defending, willing Georgia Tech to wins through sheer individual force. After just 2 years at Georgia Tech, Kenny Anderson made the decision that would change his life forever. He declared for the 1991 NBA draft, foregoing his final 2 years of eligibility. He was about to become a very rich young man, and he was about to enter a world filled with agents, contracts, temptations, expectations, and people who understood his value long before he understood his own vulnerabilities. On the night of the 1991 NBA draft, Kenny Anderson heard his name called second, right after Larry Johnson went first overall to the Charlotte Hornets. The New Jersey Nets had their point guard. The kid from LeFrak City, just 20 years old, was about to become one of the wealthiest young men in professional sports. He was the youngest player in the entire league that season. And the transition from college campus to professional arena, from dormitory life to multi-million-dollar contracts, happened so fast that there was no time to learn the things that mattered most: how to manage money, how to manage people, how to manage himself. Because what almost no one outside Kenny Anderson's inner circle understood was that he was already a father. He had become a parent while still at Georgia Tech, before he ever wore an NBA uniform. The obligations were already multiplying. The responsibilities were already stacking up on the shoulders of a young man who had never had a stable male role model, who had never seen financial planning modeled in his household, and who was now being handed more money than anyone in his family had ever imagined. The Nets believed they had their franchise cornerstone, and in many ways, they were right. Anderson's talent was real. His court vision was elite, and his ability to create for others was undeniable. But the franchise was building something bigger than just one player. The front office was assembling pieces around him, and the most important piece was already in place: a powerful young forward named Derek Coleman. And soon, a third player would arrive who would make the basketball world sit up and take notice. A sharp-shooting guard from Croatia named Dražen Petrović. Together, they looked like the foundation of something truly special. Together, they looked unstoppable. But fate had something unimaginably cruel in store. For a brief, tantalizing stretch in the early 1990s, the New Jersey Nets looked like a team on the verge of breaking through. Kenny Anderson was the floor general, quick, creative, fearless. Derek Coleman was the power forward with a game that seemed limitless, a first overall pick in his own right. And Dražen Petrović was the sharpshooter, the Croatian guard who had already proven that European players could thrive in the NBA, a man who shot the ball with a precision that bordered on mechanical perfection. This was supposed to be the era that put the Nets on the map. 3 young stars, each approaching or entering their prime, each capable of carrying a team on any given night. The whispers around the league were real. This group could compete for a championship. For Kenny Anderson, who had spent his entire life being told he was destined for greatness, this was the validation. This was the vehicle. This was the team that would take him where he was supposed to go. On June 7, 1993, Dražen Petrović lost his life in an automobile accident on the Autobahn in Germany. He was 28 years old. The news hit the Nets organization like a physical blow. One of the most gifted scorers in the game, a man who had averaged over 22 points per game in the season just completed, was gone in an instant. There was no warning, no gradual decline, no trade or injury that might have softened the loss. Just a phone call, and the future the Nets had been building toward evaporated. The franchise never recovered. Not in that era. Not with that core. Derek Coleman remained talented but inconsistent. The organization drifted. And Kenny Anderson, who was supposed to be the point guard steering a contender, was instead left as the centerpiece of a team that could never quite become what it was supposed to be. The what-if haunted everyone involved. What if Petrović had lived? What if that trio had stayed together for 5 or 6 more years? What if the Nets had reached the Eastern Conference Finals? Or further? Those questions have no answers. But even in the shadow of that tragedy, Kenny Anderson was about to play the basketball of his life. The 1993-94 season would be his masterpiece. The year he proved to the entire NBA that the kid from LeFrak City belonged among the best. And one night in April, against the Detroit Pistons, he would put on a performance for the ages. The 1993-94 season was the year Kenny Anderson silenced every remaining skeptic. He averaged 18.8 points and 9.6 assists per game, numbers that placed him among the elite point guards in the entire league. Night after night, he ran the Nets offense with a combination of speed, creativity, and fearlessness that recalled the playground legends of his youth. Only now he was doing it on the biggest stage in basketball. He was selected to the 1994 NBA All-Star Game. His first, and, as it turned out, his only All-Star appearance. For a player of his talent, one selection feels insufficient, almost unfair. But that single nod from the league confirmed what everyone who had watched him since 6th grade already knew. Kenny Anderson, at his best, was as good as anyone. And then came April 15, 1994. The Nets against the Detroit Pistons. On that night, Kenny Anderson erupted for a career-high 45 points and added 14 assists, a stat line so dominant, so complete, that it remains one of the great individual performances in Nets franchise history. 45 and 14. He was scoring from everywhere, finding teammates with passes that seemed to defy geometry, and controlling the game with an authority that made it look easy. This was the player everyone had predicted he would become. This was the ceiling. This was proof. But ceilings, in Kenny Anderson's story, were never permanent. Because while he was dazzling crowds on the basketball court, his personal life was becoming a revolving door of relationships, responsibilities, and financial obligations that no 23-year-old was equipped to manage, especially one carrying the invisible weight that Kenny had carried since childhood. Kenny Anderson is the father of 7 children by 5 different women. That single sentence contains an entire universe of complexity: emotional, logistical, legal, and financial. Each relationship came with its own expectations. Each child deserved support, attention, and resources. And Kenny, who had grown up without a father of his own, was now trying to be present for 7 children scattered across multiple households, while simultaneously maintaining an NBA career that demanded constant travel, relentless focus, and peak physical performance. The names attached to his romantic life read like a tabloid chronicle of the 1990s. He had a relationship with DJ Spinderella, D.D. Roper, the DJ of the legendary hip-hop group Salt and Peppa. He married Tommy Roman, who would later become a prominent cast member on the reality television series Basketball Wives. That marriage ended. He married a second time. That marriage also ended. In 2007, he married his third wife, Natasha. Each relationship overlapped with the pressures of professional basketball, and each departure carried financial consequences. Child support obligations multiplied, legal entanglements compounded, and the money, the enormous, seemingly inexhaustible river of NBA money, was being divided and redirected in ways that no financial plan could sustain indefinitely. But it wasn't just the women and children draining the accounts. Kenny Anderson had an entourage: family members, friends from the old neighborhood, hangers-on who materialized the moment the checks started clearing. He gave freely. He said yes when he should have said no. He wrote checks for people who would never have looked his way if he'd still been living in LeFrak City without a dollar to his name. Years later, he would issue a warning to other athletes that carried the weight of hard experience. He said, and these are his words, "I see athletes giving money to girlfriends, friends, and relatives all the time, but those can eventually be your worst enemies and put you into financial ruin." He was not speaking hypothetically. He was describing his own life, and the financial bleeding, as devastating as it already was, might have been survivable if Kenny Anderson had remained at the top of the NBA. Instead, after that glorious 1993-94 season, his career began a slow and painful decline. And the first sign came when the Nets decided they had seen enough. $63 million. The number bears repeating because of what happened to it. When people hear that figure, they imagine a vault, a fortress of wealth so massive that no human being could possibly spend through it in a single lifetime. But $63 million in gross career earnings is not $63 million in the bank. After federal and state taxes, after agent commissions, after union dues and the basic overhead of maintaining a professional athlete's life on the road, hotels, meals, travel, training, the actual take-home figure shrinks dramatically. Some financial analysts estimate that an NBA player in the 1990s might have kept roughly 40 to 50 cents of every dollar earned, depending on the state where he played. That is still an enormous sum. but it is not 63 million. Now subtract the cost of maintaining multiple households. Subtract child support obligations to 5 different women. Subtract the cars, the jewelry, the real estate, the lifestyle that every young player in that era was expected to maintain. The visible proof that you had made it. And then subtract the entourage, the family members who needed rent money, the childhood friends who needed a loan that would never be repaid, the cousins and uncles and neighborhood acquaintances who appeared at the door with a story and a handshake and left with a check. Kenny Anderson gave freely because giving was the only way he knew to be loved. He had grown up in poverty, surrounded by need, and when the money finally arrived, saying no felt like abandoning the people who had been there before the fame. The problem was that many of those people had not actually been there. They arrived with the money and would disappear with it too. But Kenny could not see that. Not then. Not while the checks were still coming in. Not while the NBA was still depositing millions into his accounts every season. Years later, his warning to other athletes would carry the unmistakable weight of personal devastation. His words were precise. I see athletes giving money to girlfriends, friends, and relatives all the time. But those can eventually be your worst enemies and put you into financial ruin. That was not a hypothetical. That was an autopsy of his own finances, delivered by a man who had learned the lesson too late. But the financial hemorrhage might have been survivable if the paychecks had kept growing. If Kenny Anderson had remained a max contract player, an all-star, the centerpiece of a franchise, the math might have worked out despite the waste. Instead, his career trajectory after that brilliant 1993-94 season bent decisively downward. And the Nets were the first team to signal that the era of Kenny Anderson as franchise savior was over. In 1996, the New Jersey Nets traded Kenny Anderson to the Charlotte Hornets. The transaction itself was routine, a standard NBA deal, players moving from one franchise to another. But the meaning beneath it was anything but routine. The Nets had drafted Kenny Anderson second overall just 5 years earlier. They had watched him grow into an all-star. They had envisioned him as the foundation of their future. And now they were sending him away. The message was unmistakable. The franchise player was no longer considered a franchise player. Charlotte was a fresh start, in theory. In practice, it was the beginning of a pattern that would define the second half of Kenny Anderson's career. Short stays, diminished roles, the slow erosion of status that comes when a team views you as a piece rather than a cornerstone. Anderson was no longer the player around whom an offense was built. He was a veteran guard, talented but carrying baggage, useful but not essential. He signed with the Portland Trail Blazers that same year. Portland was a team loaded with talent and personality, a roster that would become famous in the coming years for both its ability and its dysfunction. Anderson fit the talent profile, but he was now a complementary player, not a star. For a man who had been the most celebrated high school player in New York City history, who had been the #1 recruit in the country, who had been an NBA All-Star at 23, the adjustment was brutal. The ego absorbs those demotions slowly, the way a sponge absorbs water, until one day you realize you are saturated with the understanding that the best years are behind you. And each move meant upheaval, a new city, new teammates, a new coaching staff with new schemes and new expectations. For a player whose personal life was already defined by instability, multiple relationships, multiple children, a growing web of financial obligations, the constant relocation only deepened the chaos. There was no anchor. There was no home base. There was only the next city and the shrinking role that awaited him there. And then, in 1998, came the moment that revealed just how far Kenny Anderson's priorities had drifted from basketball. A trade that should have been routine instead became a public embarrassment. The Toronto Raptors wanted him. Kenny Anderson refused to report. Not because of basketball reasons, not because of injury, because he did not want to play in Canada. The story is as straightforward as it is damaging. In 1998, Kenny Anderson was traded to the Toronto Raptors. It was a standard NBA transaction, the kind that happens dozens of times every season. Players get moved, they pack their bags, they report to the new team. That is the job. That is the expectation. That is what every player in professional basketball understands from the day he signs his first contract. Kenny Anderson said no. He refused to report to Toronto because he did not want to play in Canada, not because of a basketball disagreement, not because of a contract dispute, because Toronto felt too far from the life he wanted, too unfamiliar, too uncomfortable, too removed from the world he thought an NBA star was supposed to inhabit. The refusal was public, and it was humiliating, not for the Raptors, but for Anderson himself. It painted the portrait of a player who had lost perspective, who had allowed personal comfort to outweigh professional obligation, who was so far removed from the hungry kid in LeFrak City that he could afford to turn down a guaranteed NBA paycheck because the zip code wasn't to his liking. The Raptors, unwilling to roster a player who did not want to be there, subsequently dealt him to the Boston Celtics. Anderson landed on his feet, technically. He had a uniform, he had a job, but the damage to his reputation was real and lasting. Around the league, the Toronto refusal became shorthand for the decline of Kenny Anderson, evidence that the prodigy had become a problem, that the talent was no longer enough to compensate for the complications that came with it. In Boston, he was a role player on a team that was not contending for anything. The Celtics of that era were in a rebuilding phase, cycling through veterans and lottery picks, searching for an identity that would not arrive for years. Anderson contributed. He was professional. But the All-Star days were a memory, and the trajectory was now unmistakably downward. What followed was a parade of jerseys: Seattle, New Orleans, Indiana, Atlanta, each stop shorter than the last, each role smaller, each paycheck thinner. The man who had once averaged nearly 10 assists per game as the engine of a franchise was now a journeyman, clinging to the edges of the league, hoping the phone would ring one more time. And somewhere beneath all the movement, all the cities and coaching staffs and locker rooms, the $63 million was vanishing. Quietly, steadily, irreversibly. By the early 2000s, Kenny Anderson's NBA career had become an exercise in survival. Not the survival of a young player fighting to prove himself, but the survival of a veteran fighting to remain relevant in a league that had already moved on. Seattle was a brief stop. New Orleans was briefer. Indiana offered a moment of stability, but only a moment. And then came Atlanta, where the Hawks signed him and then waived him on February 24th, 2005. A few weeks later, the Los Angeles Clippers claimed him off waivers, and then waived him again on March 25, 2005. Claimed and released in the span of a month. Two franchises looked at Kenny Anderson, evaluated what was left, and decided it wasn't enough. He was 34 years old. He had played 858 games in the NBA across 14 seasons. His career averages, 12.6 points and 6.1 assists per game, told the story of a player who had been very good for a long time, but who had never quite sustained the brilliance of that all-star peak. The numbers were respectable. The potential had been extraordinary. The gap between those two things was the cruelest part of the story. After the Clippers released him, Anderson made one final attempt to keep playing. He signed with Žalgiris Kaunas in Lithuania, a respected European club, and played there during the 2005 to 2006 season before being released. Professional basketball, in any form, on any continent, was finished with Kenny Anderson. And 2005 was not just the year basketball ended. It was the year everything ended. His mother, Joan, the woman who had raised him in LeFrak City, who had given him the nickname Mr. Chibbs, who had battled her own demons for decades, passed away after a heart attack in October of that year. And in that same devastating 12-month window, Kenny Anderson filed for bankruptcy. The fortune that once made him look untouchable had disappeared. The career that had defined him was over. And the woman who had been his anchor, however imperfect, was gone. He was 34 years old, and the life he had built from the asphalt courts of Queens to the hardwood floors of the NBA had collapsed into rubble. There are years that test a person, and then there are years that break a person apart and leave them to reassemble whatever they can find in the wreckage. For Kenny Anderson, 2005 was that year. Not a single catastrophe, but a cascade. 3 distinct devastations arriving in sequence, each one compounding the last until there was nothing left to lose. The career ended first. The Clippers waived him on March 25th, and no other NBA team called. 14 seasons, 858 games, an all-star appearance, a scoring record at Archbishop Malloy that had stood for 15 years, and the league's final verdict was a fax to his agent confirming that his services were no longer required. He was 34. In basketball years, that is old. In human years, it is the middle of the story. But for Kenny Anderson, the only story he had ever known how to tell, the one where he was a basketball player, had just reached its last page. Then, in October, Joan Anderson passed away after a heart attack. His mother, the woman who had raised him alone in LeFrak City, the woman who had given him the nickname Mr. Chibbs when he was still a toddler, woman who had battled addiction, instability, and painful relationships for most of her adult life, and who Kenny had supported financially throughout his career. Whatever their relationship's complications, and there were many, Joan was the one constant. She was the person who had been there before the scouts, before the headlines, before the money. And now, she was gone. Roughly 7 months after the Clippers released him, public records and later reporting confirmed the final humiliation. Kenny Anderson filed for bankruptcy. $63 million in career earnings, and by the time the lawyers finished adding up the wreckage, the number that mattered most was 0. The timing was not coincidental. It was the inevitable conclusion of years of unchecked spending, entourage obligations, child support across 5 households, and a lifestyle that had been sustained entirely by the assumption that another paycheck was always coming. When the paycheck stopped, the math collapsed instantly. Career, mother, money. All 3 vanished in a single calendar year. For a man already carrying the unspoken weight of childhood trauma, the absence of a father, and the wreckage of multiple failed relationships, 2005 was not a rough patch. It was the year the life he had built finally collapsed under everything he had never healed. Before the bankruptcy was filed, before his mother's passing, Kenny Anderson made one last attempt to hold on to the only identity he had ever known. He signed with Žalgiris Kaunas in Lithuania, a storied European basketball club, respected on that continent, but a universe removed from the arenas where Anderson had spent his career. Consider the distance. Not just the miles between Queens and Kaunas, but the distance between who Kenny Anderson had once been and where the game had finally left him. He had been on the front page of New York City newspapers at 14. He had played in the NBA All-Star game. He had scored 45 points against the Detroit Pistons on a night when every pass and every crossover felt like destiny. And now he was overseas, far from the league that had once celebrated him, chasing one more season in a place that made it impossible to pretend he was still the same star. He was released after the 2005 to 2006 season. No more offers followed, not from Europe, not from Asia, not from anywhere. The game that had been the organizing principle of his entire existence, the thing that had pulled him out of LeFrak City, that had given him purpose during the years when he was silently carrying the trauma of childhood abuse, that had provided the money and the fame and the identity, was finished with him. The courts went silent. The cheering stopped. And Kenny Anderson, for the first time since he was 6 years old, had to figure out who he was without a basketball in his hands. That question would take years to answer. And before the answer came, the darkness would deepen considerably. Back in the United States, with no career and no fortune, Kenny Anderson's private struggles became impossible to contain. Alcohol, which had been a presence around him for years, the same struggle that had haunted his mother's life, was now beginning to consume his own. In December of 2011, Anderson was arrested on Long Island after a serious car incident involving 2 trees. He was charged with driving while intoxicated. According to reports, authorities said alcohol was a significant factor in the incident. The crash did not harm him. It did not harm anyone else. But it dragged into public view a battle that had been waging in private for far too long. In January of 2012, Anderson pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of driving while ability impaired, which is a lesser offense under New York state law. He was sentenced to a conditional discharge and ordered to attend a drinking and driving program. In a narrow legal sense, the matter was resolved. In every other sense, it was a warning siren. Kenny Anderson had watched alcohol destroy his mother. He had grown up in a household defined by its chaos, where substance abuse and violence were background noise. And now, decades later, the same patterns were asserting themselves in his own life, as if the damage was hereditary, passed down not through genetics alone, but through environment, through modeling, through the accumulated weight of never having processed what happened in that crowded apartment in Queens. The arrest was humiliating. A former NBA All-Star, a man who had earned $63 million, crashing into trees on Long Island with a blood alcohol level that said everything words could not. But humiliation, for some people, is the beginning of honesty. And Kenny Anderson, slowly, painfully, was approaching the point where honesty was the only option left. In 2017, a documentary called Mr. Chibbs was released, named after the childhood nickname Joan Anderson had given her son when he was still small enough to carry. The film was directed by Kirk Fraser and followed Kenny Anderson as he confronted, on camera, the full scope of what his life had become and what it had cost him. The documentary did not flinch. It addressed the painful childhood experiences he had disclosed in 2013, involving a neighbor and a basketball coach, experiences he had carried in silence for decades. It addressed the absent father he did not meet until his 30s. It addressed the alcohol, the bankruptcy, the failed marriages, the 7 children by 5 women, the entourage that drained him dry, and it addressed something less tangible, but equally devastating. The loss of identity that comes when the thing that defined you, the thing that made you special, that made people love you, that gave your life its structure and its meaning, is taken away. Anderson was raw in the film. He did not perform the role of the reformed athlete delivering polished lessons. He sat with his pain. He named it. He allowed the cameras to capture a man in the process of reckoning with himself, not a man who had already completed the journey, but one who was still in the middle of it, uncertain of the destination. The film was well received. Critics praised its honesty. Audiences connected with the vulnerability of a man willing to strip away the mythology of the prodigy and show what was underneath. Not a cautionary tale neatly packaged for motivational speeches, but a human being still trying to figure out how to live without the roar of the crowd. And for Kenny Anderson, the documentary seemed to mark a turning point. Not a sudden cinematic transformation, but the slow beginning of something that might, with enough time and enough work, resemble peace. After the bankruptcy, after his mother's passing, after the DUI arrest, and the long reckoning of the documentary, Kenny Anderson did something that no one would have predicted during his All-Star season. He went back to the beginning, not to LeFrak City, and not to the NBA. He went back to the gym, but this time he stood on the sideline. Anderson became a coach. He worked at the high school level first, then at small colleges, taking the knowledge he had accumulated across 14 NBA seasons and delivering it to young players who would never sniff a lottery pick. Eventually, he was named head coach at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, a historically black university competing in Division III, a level of college basketball so far removed from the bright lights of the NBA that the two might as well exist on different planets. Consider the scale of that transition. The number 2 overall pick in the 1991 draft, an NBA All-Star, a man who had shared a backcourt with Dragan Petrovic and gone toe-to-toe with the best point guards of his generation, and now he was coaching at a Division III school, running practices in modest gymnasiums, recruiting players whose highlight tapes would never trend on social media. For some men, that descent would feel like humiliation. For Kenny Anderson, it was something closer to salvation. He simplified everything. The entourage was gone. The fleet of cars was gone. The sprawling lifestyle that had consumed $63 million was replaced by something quieter, smaller, and sustainable. In a later reflection reported by Basketball Network, Anderson conveyed the essence of his new reality in plain terms. He was no longer the millionaire he used to be, but he was well off. The man who had spent decades chasing the approval of everyone around him had finally learned that peace does not come from the size of your bank account. It comes from the absence of chaos. Coaching gave him structure. It gave him purpose. And perhaps, most importantly, it gave him an audience of young men who needed to hear exactly what Kenny Anderson had learned the hard way. That talent without discipline is a lit fuse, and that money without wisdom is just a slower form of poverty. Kenny Anderson's collapse was not unique. It was not even unusual. In 2009, Sports Illustrated published a widely cited report estimating that roughly 60% of NBA players go broke within 5 years of retirement. 60%. That figure has been debated and discussed in the years since, but its core finding has never been seriously disputed. Professional athletes, particularly those who come from poverty, face a staggering risk of financial ruin once the paychecks stop. Anderson was one of the most prominent examples. But the question his story raises is not why did he fail? The question is, why was he set up to fail? When Kenny Anderson entered the NBA in 1991, he was 20 years old, the youngest player in the league. He had come from a housing project. He had no father. He had been sexually abused as a child. His mother struggled with addiction. He had never managed money because there had never been money to manage. And the league handed him a multi-million-dollar contract and essentially said good luck. There were no mandatory financial literacy programs in that era. No mental health resources built into the system. No transition counselors for young men who had gone from sharing a bedroom with their mother's abusive boyfriend to signing documents that guaranteed them more money than their entire neighborhood had ever seen. The infrastructure that exists today, imperfect as it still is, simply did not exist when Kenny Anderson was drafted. He was an asset. His job was to play basketball and generate revenue. What happened to him after the final buzzer was his problem. And this is the uncomfortable truth at the center of the story. The NBA did not create Kenny Anderson's wounds. It did not make his father disappear. It did not put predators in his childhood. It did not place addiction inside his home. But the league did profit from his gift while doing far too little in that era to protect the damaged young man behind it. If you take a 20-year-old from the projects, a kid carrying unprocessed trauma, a kid who has never seen a functioning model of financial stability, a kid whose only skill is putting a ball through a hoop, and you give him tens of millions of dollars with no guidance, no structure, and no safety net, his collapse should not shock anyone. Kenny Anderson's bankruptcy was not a mystery. It was the bill coming due for a life nobody had taught him how to survive. But there is one more chapter to this story, one that takes us back to where it all began. Because decades after leaving LeFrak City, Kenny Anderson went looking for the one person who had been missing from his life since the very beginning. Kenny Anderson grew up without a father. That fact has been mentioned before in this story, but it deserves its own space because of the weight it carried across every chapter of his life. No father at the dinner table. No father in the stands at Archbishop Malloy. No father in the crowd at the NBA draft when his name was called second overall. No father to call when the marriages failed, when the money disappeared, when the bottle became easier to reach for than the phone. He did not meet his father until he was in his 30s. By then, Kenny had already lived an entire life. Prodigy, college star, NBA All-Star, millionaire, father of 7, bankrupt, alcoholic, survivor of childhood abuse. All of it without the man who was supposed to be there from the beginning. The meeting, when it finally came, could not return the birthdays, the games, the school nights, the lonely mornings, or the years when a boy needed a father and found only empty space. It could not undo the absence that had shaped nearly every relationship Kenny ever had. His desperate need to be loved, his inability to set boundaries, and his pattern of surrounding himself with people who took from him without giving back. The absent father is one of the oldest stories in American life, and it echoes with particular force in communities like LeFrak City, where generations of boys have grown up learning to define manhood through whatever models were available. The streets, the courts, the television screen. Kenny Anderson became a father himself at an impossibly young age, while still at Georgia Tech, and went on to have 7 children by 5 women. The cycle did not repeat itself exactly. Kenny was present in his children's lives in ways his own father never was. But the damage of that original absence shaped everything. Every dollar given away to someone who didn't deserve it. Every relationship entered too quickly and exited too painfully. Every moment of silence when the crowd disappeared and he was left alone with the question that no amount of money or fame could answer. Why wasn't I enough for him to stay? Kenny Anderson's story does not end with a trophy. It does not end with a comeback season or a ceremony at center court. It ends, as of now, with a man still alive, still working, still coaching young players at a level that would have seemed unimaginable to the 14-year-old on the cover of the New York City sports pages. And perhaps that is the most honest ending this story could have. He earned $63 million and lost it all. He carried painful childhood experiences for decades before finally speaking about them publicly in his 40s. He watched his mother die the same year he went bankrupt. He battled alcohol. He failed at marriage 3 times. He fathered 7 children and tried imperfectly to be the father his own father never was. And after all of it, after LeFrak City, after Archbishop Malloy, after Georgia Tech, after the All-Star game and the 45-point explosion against Detroit, and the Nomad years and Lithuania and the DUI and the documentary, Kenny Anderson is still here. His tragedy was never that he didn't make it. Plenty of prodigies flame out before they reach the league. Kenny made it all the way. He climbed from a crowded apartment in Queens to the 2nd pick in the NBA draft, to an All-Star jersey, to $63 million. He reached the life everyone told him would save him. And then he discovered the cruelest truth of all. Success can change your address, your bank account, and the way strangers look at you. But it cannot heal the damage you refuse or were never taught to face. The question his story leaves behind is not about Kenny Anderson. It is about the next Kenny Anderson, the next 6-year-old on a concrete court in a housing project somewhere in America, dribbling a ball with a gift so obvious that grown men are already circling, already calculating his value, already planning how to profit from what he can do. That boy is out there right now. And unless the people and systems around him do more than cheer, unless they protect him as fiercely as they recruit him, his story will end the same way. Kenny Anderson survived. But survival, in his case, was never guaranteed. And maybe that is the real tragedy. He did not lose because he failed to become great. He became great. He made the money. He wore the All-Star jersey. He lived the dream every young player on a concrete court is told to chase. But greatness was never enough to save the boy everyone forgot to protect.